Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective.
Welcome to Behavioral Health Today. I'm your host, Dr. Graham Taylor. Joining me today is Amy Pickett-Williams, a seasoned licensed clinical social worker and psychotherapist with over 25 years of experience in Denver. Amy specializes in grief, trauma, and somatic therapy, and is the founder of LIGHT, which is an acronym for Love in Grief Held Together. That's beautiful. Life is a movement dedicated to collective support and healing. Drawing from her personal experience and professional experience as well, Amy integrates mind, body, and spirit in her work. In addition to her psychotherapy practice, she's a certified yoga teacher and has extensive experience in medical, school-based, and private practice settings. We're excited to have Amy with us today to discuss the holistic and inclusive approach of the LIGHT movement, highlighting its commitment to addressing various forms of grief through somatic healing and connection. Amy, welcome to our show.
Thank you. I'm glad
Great
to
to
be
have
here.
you here. So nice to have you. Hey, Amy, as we start out, let's maybe have you start out by sharing with us your story, including how you were inspired to create the LIGHT movement, maybe some of your own experiences that contributed to this. Start us out with your story today.
I would be honored to. So professionally, I have been a grief psychotherapist for 25 years. My heart song is working with families who experience the death of a child. But over the years, it's morphed into all types of loss, including the loss of a loved one, human or pet, loss of relationship, loss of the ability to have children and fertility, miscarriage. I mean, you name it, loss of self, loss of identity. And so it's always been my heart song. Well, my dad was a very known attorney in the education law field. And for about the 25 years I've done this work, he always said, Amy, you should speak to your work with the death and dying and the grief and loss. You have stories and education to tell people. And I always said to my dad, I appreciate your opinion on that, but I'm a therapist. I'm more of an introvert. I don't think I could ever be a public speaker. And my dad really encouraged me, and he was a very humble attorney, yet he was very known, and people called him the gentle giant. He stood 6'5" and spoke nationally on mandated reporting, so ensuring that things were reported if kids were being abused. He spoke nationally on preventing school violence. And his last big hurrah before he died, which I'll go into in a minute, was to ensure transgender youth had safe restrooms in public schools. And he wasn't able to finish that, but he started to speak on that nationally. So I loved what he did, and I loved how he spoke to it. But I always thought, that's not my cup of tea. I'm much more the one-on-one type person. Well, fast forward to the time of COVID, and we have a younger son. We have 3 children. Our youngest one had some major health issues, so we had to be home longer than most until he was vaccinated. And so our family would go camping, and my parents had this RV. We're not RV people, but they are. And so we would go camping with them, and it was an amazing time. And I've always found such support and solace in nature, and as had my parents, and which is what we did as children a lot. And so in October of 2020, we were camping, and my parents, we had a beautiful weekend. My oldest son and I had to leave a little early because he had a big swim competition. And so everyone ended up leaving a bit later, my husband with our other kids and my parents, and my dad went to put the RV away with my mom. They stored it because they couldn't store it where their house was. And a big gust of wind knocked him over, and he ended up falling on his head, and he ended up with a brain bleed. And 2 days later, we had to withdraw life support. And it was hard. It was really hard and very unexpected. And it was very, very hard on our whole family, especially my oldest son, who always thought of him as his hero. He was 12 when that happened. And so fast forward, we went through our grief. Obviously, professionally, I'd been doing this grief work for years. Personally, I'd had other losses like we all had. This one was a profound one for me personally. But we started to work towards integrating our grief and finding some meaning. Not that he died for a reason, but how do we move forward with our grief? And eventually there came a time where life started to get back to a somewhat sort of normalcy. My kids finally went back to school. Thank goodness. Some people are very good homeschooling parents. That was not my cup of tea. So we get back in, and my husband and I are so fortunate that we get a weekend away. And my mom agreed to watch the kids back, and this was last spring on my birthday, actually. So March in 2023. And we decided to go to Ojo Caliente, which are some hot springs outside of Taos, New Mexico. And my husband's a huge mountaineer, rock climber. So of course he said, let's go for a hike too. And there was this beautiful mesa, and I agreed. And so we started hiking up this mesa, and we went up to this beautiful mica mine, and it was full of shimmering diamond-like experience. Mica is very shiny in the sun, and it was beautiful. And then we had to walk our way back down. And on our way down, about a third of the way down in the path, there was this juniper tree that strutted out from the rocks, and it was beautiful, and it helped me tremendously get down this very steep section. And being the vegan and the hippie that I am, after the juniper tree helped me, I gave it a big hug. I told my husband, I know this tree has supported so many people. And my husband, not being the vegan and not being the hippie, said, yes, Amy, I'm sure it has. And so we kept going down this path, and we get to the last section, and it's a very, very, very steep section. And my husband said, how about I lead? Right? I'm a mountaineer and a rock climber. And I said, no, honey, it's my birthday. I'm leading this hike. And so I start going down this last very steep section, knowing how steep it was because we'd gone up it, right? And unfortunately, I tripped and I fell over 40 feet. I ended up with 600 cactus spines, a fractured tibia. At one point in my fall, I hit my head very, very hard. And that's the only thing I actually remember, thinking to myself, oh my God, I don't want to die like my dad did.
Yes.
But eventually I stopped, and I should have fallen 100 feet, and I likely should be dead, but you can only guess what stopped me. It was another juniper tree.
Juniper tree.
So we rushed to the hospital, and we get to the hospital, and they want to make sure I don't have a brain bleed. The good news is I did not. I had a severe concussion, but I did not have a brain bleed. They said, you'll be pulling cactus spines out for the next year of your body. For any of you in Arizona or in the desert, know that. They just stay with you. The big ones you can pull out, the small ones you can't. And so my husband, they finally said, you can be discharged. And so after about 12 hours, and they said, you need to get back to Denver, where I live, to make sure you're going to figure out your tibia. It's fractured, but you can get to Denver for that. It's not a severe fracture. And so my husband went to get the car, and he was waiting in the drive area of the hospital, and I didn't come out. So he came in to get me, and I'd fully passed out again.
Oh.
He thought now I died twice in a day because my eyes were fully dilated. They decided to readmit me. The good news is I did not get charged another copay. And they readmit me into the hospital, and they thought maybe she has a belly bleed. We did so many scans of her body, but we didn't do her belly. And sure enough, I did not have a belly bleed, but they found a mass. They said, get back to Denver for your tibia and also what we're seeing in your belly. We went back to Denver, and more scans later, it turns out I had cancer. So the juniper tree saved my life twice.
Absolutely.
So now going back to my dad. Last early summer and late spring, I had to have surgery, and I had to, recover from everything that I was going through. And my dad's voice came back to me. And this time I listened because I had time to listen. And he kept saying, Amy, this is your time. This is your time. And so September of last year, exactly a year ago, I got a group of volunteers together, and I said, I think we need to do something around healing and somatic healing, that mind-body connection, which we'll go into, I'm sure, on the show.
You bet.
And so we got a group of volunteers together. The other piece that's really important, though, and that's significant about September, is we also got a whole bunch of faith representatives together of every possible religion we could get together to stand in solidarity for all people and all types of grief, because it's the one thing none of us are immune from.
Absolutely.
And so we got rabbis, we got Muslim representatives, we got Native Americans, Buddhists, Christians, Catholics, you name it. We tried to get them together, and we did. And there's significance to September. We started planning this in September, and then the horror of Israel and Gaza happened in October. And the most beautiful thing that happened is all these representatives still came together And on the solstice, December 21st, we had about 200 people in person and over 500 people view it online
Oh my
to
God.
say we have to be together in our loss.
Yeah.
While we may come from many different stories and many different beliefs, we all know this pain of grief.
Mhm.
So we had this beautiful event. And about 2 weeks later, my dad's voice came back to me and said, "Don't think you're done." And so we got a group of volunteers together and we formed this nonprofit with 4 goals: to remind people they're not alone in their grief, to teach these somatic based tools to support integration and finding meaning and purpose. Not saying that things happen for a reason. And I want to make that very clear. Our nonprofit doesn't go there. I know as a grief therapist, many people do have those beliefs, but that's not our nonprofits because we're accepting of everyone. But what do we do once we've experienced it? How do we find meaning in moving forward? Our third goal is to connect with other resources to support people in grief. So other nonprofits and other people that support them. And our fourth one, which fits with the solstice event, is to stand in solidarity for all people and all types of grief. And so we formed this nonprofit. We actually just got our 501c3 a month ago, which
Nice.
is a big
Congrats.
deal.
That's
It's something
huge.
I know nothing about, but I'm learning a lot about. And so our goal is we offer classes, and I know we can go into more of this later if you'd like, but we in Colorado and also virtually, we offer trainings to hopefully teach people how to understand the tools and the science of grief in order to go to their community and their culture. So we have a social justice lens to ensure that if someone in Africa is taking our training, they can morph it to what fits in their community or anywhere in the world. And we have grief retreats and burnout retreats. And of course, we're going to do our solstice event. And that will be an annual tradition, which is what started us out. So that is my
Wow.
story.
That's a wonderful story. I don't think I've had such a wonderful start to a podcast talking about someone's stories. We got some good stories, not to put anybody else down, but this is a lovely start. And I appreciate you sharing your heart with us around this and watching to see. I love your openness to listen and to respond, and to your dad's voices and to what your heart's kind of tugging you towards. I'd love to see how these things you've been attuned to, these life events, have led to the whole light movement. Describe for us light, if you would. And it's emphasizing the things you described, this interconnectedness of mind and body and spirit in the grieving process. Say just a little bit more about this. And when we talk about light, I put this in the introduction as well. This is love in grief held together. What a lovely acronym. And what a lovely way to describe that. Say a little bit more about it for us.
Yeah. So the love and grief, we all know that when we experience grief, we experience love or attachment to something that's very important to us. That's how we experience grieving, right? And so the held together is partly the love and grief together. But the other part of held together is we have to support each other in this experience. We have to hold each other. No matter, again, what my story is, Graham, what your story is, we all universally know that experience of grief and be present for another human being.
We'll be right back after word from our sponsor.
Are you preparing for a licensure exam in psychology, social work, marriage and family therapy, counseling, or behavioral analysis? AATBS is here to help. We have been supporting behavioral and mental health students to prepare for their licensure exams for more than 45 years, working with over 1 million students to succeed on test day and move on to the next step in their career. With products ranging from comprehensive courses to quiz banks and delivered live online, self-study online, and in print, AATBS has test prep solutions that meet every student's needs and learning styles. Visit us today at aatbs.com. That's aatbs.com and use promo code BHT15 to save 15% off your next purchase.
Yeah, I like what you're saying here too. I've had people come in and done some grief work in my practice as well. And one of the things I say early on is I'm and I say it very tenderly, but I mean it. I'm so happy for you that you get to grieve something that feels so painful, because what that tells me is that you had a really solid attachment and you shared something so very meaningful. Because if you hadn't, I've had people too come in and say, hey, I lost somebody. I feel kind of guilty because I don't feel much at all. And usually when we kind of explore it more, we find out that there wasn't much of an attachment there. They think they should because it was an uncle or maybe even a parent sometimes. But if there wasn't an attachment there prior, there's no real connection to really feel some of the things that we almost hope people get to feel in loss, because it means they had an experience in life that was so worthwhile and so meaningful that they get to kind of honor it and respect it. But grief is unique, isn't it? And like you said earlier, it's going to be an expected part of all of our lives. And
Mhm.
I think, we don't get out of this thing called life without grieving something. And although grief is, probably identified most clearly with a loss of a loved one, there are other types of grief that you were mentioning at the very beginning, whether it's the loss of a pet or dealing with infertility or a miscarriage. There are various kinds of grief that we don't oftentimes give credit to think that this holds something for the person as well. And what if we need to work through this and we can do so in a way where we join somebody? Say more about the different kinds of grief that you work with and you see coming into your practice.
Yeah, I actually have a sweet little story. Recently, I gave a workshop to a group of Parkinson's patients and their caregivers. And
Mm,
there were about 50 people there and was presenting on light. And afterwards, it really surprised me. People came up to the person that organized it and said, I didn't really think this applied to me because I haven't really experienced the death. And I thought, wow, this is a person experiencing Parkinson's, right?
yeah,
And so in the workshop, they recognized I have experienced so much loss. It's the loss of my health. It's the loss of my independence. And for the caregiver, it's the loss of what they used to do with their partner, right?
that's
Or
right.
the person that they loved. They used to go out and about and they're not able to do what they, were able to do. And so I think it's so important to note that so many of us don't think about it that way,
No,
right? And
no.
so a lot of people are like, "Oh, you're an organization that works with death and dying." And I'm like, No,
Yeah, we're not
we're an
Kubler-Ross.
organization that works with all loss."
Right. That's right. So how do you come in and how do you almost reframe what grief is really about and what loss can really entail? It's not just the death of a loved one. It's something deeper in terms of meaning for the person. How do you frame it for people?
Yeah, when I do workshops, I actually start just by asking. I'm like, "What is something or someone that has been
Yeah.
really important to you that you no longer have?"
Yeah.
And you've experienced emotions around that.
Yeah.
And I usually start out there, and then that's why people say, "Oh, well, I had a breakup, right, of someone I really cared about, or a divorce, or I had a breakup and I realized how much I was kind of thrilled that the breakup was done, but my children, man, they suffered, right? Or I had this car accident and now I don't feel safe driving. And
Right.
so I have a loss of safety now.
You bet.
Or our world and climate is changing. And I have a loss of knowing that our world would be the way I thought it would be with all these wildfires here in Colorado or
Mhm.
tsunamis in other places. Or our house was robbed last night.
Right.
Or this war that's going on is really impacting me because I have friends that identify as Jewish, or I have friends that identify as Palestine, or I have family that lives in Ukraine.
Yeah. You're almost encouraging people to pause and maybe take kind of a myopic view of loss and grief and just kind of open the aperture up just a wee bit to see that, well, wait a minute, maybe there are other things here, whether it's the loss of finances or the loss of an expectation, the loss of a job, the wars, the climate, the things you're describing. And I would imagine people's heads begin to kind of nod like, wait a minute, there's a larger meaning here that touches us all
Yes.
to some degree or another.
Yeah. And I'll add one more. The loss of self is also a big one that I see in my private practice. I might be working with new parents, a new mom that comes in, and she's so excited that she has a baby, but maybe she's also having some postpartum feelings.
Mm,
And then as we start to do our work together, she'll say, "I love my baby. And I miss my old self.
Yes. Yeah. It's interesting because grief is incredibly challenging because it touches so many aspects of our lives and our emotions. There's the emotional intensity, it can bring a storm of intense emotions. It can be overwhelming and difficult to manage. Or, like you said earlier, it's a loss of normalcy. The landscape of our lives can fundamentally be changed and lost at some
Mhm.
point. Or there's the uncertainty about what's the future going to hold, and worry about how am I going to cope with that loss. I think there's also this piece. I'd like to get your thought on this, but the isolation that can come from loss as well. It's hard for people, to fully understand maybe what my loss is and what it means to me. Maybe to some degree vicariously, but to really understand the way that I experience it, sometimes that sense of isolation, or maybe there's mixed feelings too around, I feel maybe I've been dealing with somebody who's been really suffering for a long period of time, and I've been the primary caregiver, and I feel kind of a mix of relief that they've passed and also guilt for feeling that. I'm not supposed to feel that, right? Or maybe I had somebody
Mhm.
pass that really hurt me, and I'm supposed to be sad at their loss, but I'm also angry at the things that I never got to work
Mhm.
out or fulfill with them. And this can be confusing, yeah, and challenging to navigate, can't it?
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. It brings in so many different feelings, right?
Yeah.
There's so much chaos along emotions, which leads me a little bit to what brought it up in my head is the beauty of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I have so much gratitude for her for bringing
Absolutely.
grief and loss to the surface, and we realize that her study was for terminally ill patients that
Yeah.
for the most part did follow a linear fashion, not always. The part that was missing was it wasn't for caregivers. It wasn't for people that are experiencing the after effects of a death
Mhm.
or loss in general, which leads to what you were saying is that in reality, what we now know is that people have all these feelings, but it's kind of a chaotic mess, right?
A
It's
chaotic
not a
mess.
linear fashion. I
It's
mean, I
not.
might be numb and then I might be angry and then I might be
Oh,
numb again and then I might be anxious, and then I might be feel a little bit of peace, but oh my gosh, another trigger, right? And it's all over the place.
yeah, I think that's a great thing to normalize it. This can be a chaotic process to hold and have to sit with all of these feelings. And while we're saying it's normal and everybody goes through it, not everybody talks about it, but everybody goes through it. And then there's also, I think on top of that, sometimes too, the societal expectation that, there's something about long grief and how long should it be and how you should go through something, correctly as you grieve it. So the societal expectations kind of can add kind of a pressure around this. And I think that leads sometimes to the isolation that people feel with, if you know what was going on inside of my head right now in my heart, and I were to share that with you, you would think I'm all over the place. And
Mhm.
so I hold that inside. And then I had this expectation that maybe I should go through it differently. It's a lot of pressure sometimes to feel like I've got to go through this grieving process that's so very deeply personal to me.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Well, what do you find to be some of the misconceptions about grief? And how do you, at light, kind of tackle some of this?
Yeah. So, I mean, the one misconception, I just mentioned is it's not a linear fashion.
Good.
And so many people think, well, if I just talk about it, maybe I'll get better. But what we know, and this is part of light, is we believe it's important to work with grief somatically from that mind body perspective, or some people say mind, body, spirit, or soul. And what that means is talking about it definitely serves a purpose, right? I mean, sharing your story 100% does serve a purpose. And even though I was trained as a talk therapist, I now know we have to work with our bodies
Yeah.
because we hold grief in our bodies.
You bet.
And there's beautiful science behind that, right? Dr. Dan Siegel is the one that invented the window of tolerance, that place where we feel like we're in our experience of like we can live in the present moment. We can feel relatively at peace. The yogis call it sattva. Dr. Stephen Porges, who came up with an added part to window of tolerance, calling it polyvagal theory, which I'll go into
Yeah.
in a second, called it ventral vagal. I mean, there's many different terms, whether Eastern or Western, where we recognize, okay, we're in our zone where we're tolerating life, right? We may have ups
Got it.
and downs, but we're in our window. I think what's important to note in the grief world is that, and as a grief therapist and as a grief yogi, part of me recognizes that we have to help people get back into that window. So they might be above the window in that fight flight response where they're angry and they're terrified that something horrific happens. But then what Dr. Stephen Porges talks a lot about is when we go on the opposite end of our window, below our window, which is that hypoarousal. Dr. Siegel mentioned that too, but Dr. Porges added more to it in regards to when he talked a lot about when you're in that dorsal phase. That can be a dissociative phase. That can also be this hypoarousal where we're just kind of dead to the world, right? We're immobile. And so part of what the light movement recognizes is we need to help people learn how to get back into their window. But just as importantly, when I have a grief client that has had a recent, really horrific loss, their window is about the size of a
Right.
dollhouse window, right?
Right.
And so some of these tools that we're teaching in light movement is how to expand that window so that maybe it's the size of a sliding glass door, so that when they're riding those waves, they may not be going outside it or below it on a regular basis. And we do that through somatic body-based tools. Dr. Porges talks a lot about the vagus nerve, right? And that's our 10th cranial nerve. And it's a bidirectional highway that goes from basically our brainstem down to our lower torso. But the interesting thing about the vagus nerve is it's bidirectional, but it's 80% body communicating to brain and only about 20% brain to body. So if I'm going to talk to you, I'm really only working with 20% of my nervous system, right? As I'm being able to share my story. And so if we can work with our body on these tools by stimulating the vagus nerve and other forms of body movements, such as intentional walking, which is utilizing both sides of the brain, right?
Yeah, it's kind of bilateral.
Any expansions and contractions, right? When we open up our bodies to heart song, looking up, we're allowing that vulnerability to showing like, this is what I'm experiencing right now in my life. And this is hard. And the same is also true, which is just as important, is that contraction, going in and saying, I need some time and some space. And the beauty of the vagus nerve is breathing techniques stimulate that vagus nerve to get us back into that parasympathetic calming response inside our window. So a longer exhale, and there's hundreds of them, which we utilize a lot of them in the light movement. Vibration and humming and singing, bee's breath. You guys might want to try it for a minute, just placing your hand on your throat and humming. You'll experience the vibration of that vagus nerve just by humming. You can feel it, right? And so acupressure points in your eyes and along your ears, especially your ears, the cranial nerves in your ears and your head connect to the vagus nerve. So just little gentle massages along your ear help us get into that parasympathetic response, that window of tolerance. And obviously I'm a yogi, so any of the yoga poses, even as gentle as they are, those contractions and expansions, the bilateral, moving from one pose to another, all help us get into that calming, that window of tolerance, and help us grow our window. And so walking, hiking, yoga, journaling, painting, singing, humming. I mean, there's so many beautiful ways we can work with our grief intentionally to help us grow. And one other piece I think is really important in the light movement, we don't believe that you heal from grief. We believe you grow from grief. And Lois Tonkin was a mental health provider back in the 90s. And many people have seen one of her drawings. And it's something we really believe in the light movement. If there's 3 balls and there's 3 jars, the balls represent grief. And each jar has a ball in it. Those balls do not shrink. Imagine them as steel balls. But if we do our work, our jars will grow. So each jar, as we work with our grief, gets bigger. And so that the grief is always there, just like if lightning strikes a tree. But if we nurture it and tend to it, our tree will continue to grow. But the scar of our loss will always be a part of us.
I think that's so important, man. There's so many. That was such a rich section right there. There's so many good things in that. And I love the focus on the somatic piece of this. Soma is our body. And, Van der Kolk and the authors you're talking about say that, the body holds the trauma as well, as long as our mind. And we don't oftentimes look at that piece. We kind of go through grief in a cognitive, nature. And No, our body holds it. And all the things you're saying right there that can stimulate the vagus nerve, the healing process. I love that piece. And, we even know now with research coming out that, when a mom has a baby, she delivers, the baby carries some of the mom cells and the mom holds some of the baby cells. So when you say feels like I've lost a part of myself when you lose a parent, you've literally lost a part of yourself when you've lost a parent. It's real.
That's right.
Or when a mom
That's
has that
right.
intuition or that sense, it's real because there's something there that's far deeper than we appreciate. It just at a whole nother level that I love. And I love this idea too, where you're saying we get to grow from our grief. We get to learn how to carry it differently and maybe even find ways to be resilient and appreciative. I know that some of the Kubler-Ross things have kind of another layer to it where they talk about this transcendent
Mhm.
quality where you're growing from this, not just I'm accepting it and resigned to it, but what could it mean to me? And look at what your story holds. Your story holds this sense of some really significant losses
Mhm.
and challenges. And look what you're doing to grow from that and to learn to carry the losses in a way that's manageable, but also to honor those losses in a way that others get to benefit in some very
Mhm.
meaningful ways from what you've chosen to do in your transcendence around this. That's very meaningful.
Thank you.
Yeah, very meaningful. Well, we mentioned a little bit earlier that you are a nonprofit now. That's not an easy thing to attain, but with this transition, how's it going to be impacting your ability to reach and support more people in this grief journey and this whole light movement?
Yeah. Well, our goal is global, right? Is to be able to teach these tools for other people to teach these tools. And so it truly is a global mission and vision, not just in our local state. And so part of that is through trainings, which one we have in October that will have a virtual component and we'll continue to offer trainings. The good news is we have the training in October is we have continuing ed credits for psychologists, social workers, LMFTs, nursing, and our goal is to add more teachers and chaplains. Obviously, we've tried really, really hard to get as many as possible, but it'll take some time, but we'll offer it again. And then anyone that's experiencing grief can take our trainings. We actually have several that are signed up that just said, I want to understand this better because I've tried talk therapy and it's not working for me as much as I thought it would, which is not a surprise for me, but might be a surprise for others, right? And so they have the opportunity to take this training, and we also have this beautiful volunteer format where if we drop tuition significantly if they're willing to volunteer for light. And light, that means bringing light to their communities.
Mm.
That means outreach and telling people about what we're offering. That means hopefully some fundraising because we just got our insurance bill and it's $13,000 a year. And my husband said, we cannot tap into our home and equity line of credit anymore, Amy. I'm sorry. So there's many ways to volunteer for light.
Really
The
good.
other piece, though, is that we'll be building our virtual platform and we'll be having virtual classes that are all donation based. So people that are attending our classes now, some pay nothing and some pay, 5, 10, or 15 or $20. We believe in this reaching everyone because there's not enough therapists out there right now that can support people because grief is so significant.
Yeah, it is. So this is going to be October 2nd through the 6th. This is going to be a 20-hour somatic healing training. Is that correct?
3rd through 6th. We had it on, I think, the 2nd, and we realized that was a Jewish holiday, and we greatly apologize for that. So we actually changed it and just added some hours on the weekend because we believe in supporting all people, and that was our mistake. So we switched it. So it's the 3rd through the 6th.
Doesn't sound like a big thing, just a mistake, and it's fixed. That's good. That's good.
Mhm.
So then this training here, and I may be speaking to some of our listeners here today. For those that are new, maybe to somatic healing, you're saying there's a whole nother level at which we can work that we kind of know about, but you're teaching people first to acknowledge that it's there, two, to appreciate it for what it is, and then three, how to get in there and what to do with it in a way that can really bring about change. And sometimes, what we know about how we're created and our psychology is that a lot of these things that we experience are beyond words. Some of the things that we experience around loss, they happen before words. Maybe we had some early traumas or losses. And so what you're allowing people is not to have to be dependent upon putting words to their loss. And in fact, sometimes people shy away from coming into a place. Because if I go to grief counseling, I'm going to have to talk about my loss, aren't I? And I don't want to do that. It's just too stirring for me. But if I'm going to learn maybe how to go for a walk, or, how to use my voice, or how to do something somatically, that's almost like a nice little introduction, almost kind of tilling the soil, if you will, to get some things moving and get some relaxation coming. You're talking about, the vagus nerve and how it kind of stimulates the parasympathetic, nervous system, and parasympathetic, paramedic. Paramedics make us feel better. And when we stimulate that system throughout our body, we feel better. And we begin to kind of embrace our grief, like you're saying, in a way it's a little more tolerable, a little more manageable. And then you're saying maybe out of that, I would imagine, that words begin to come, or people maybe more freely and maybe more safely, because they got some control now from their body. They're able to hold it differently. I would imagine sometimes words just kind of begin to kind of almost organically come up. Is that your experience?
Yes, absolutely. It may start out with a sensation of,
Yeah.
Amy, I'm coming to see you because my doctor tells me nothing's wrong with my stomach, but my stomach is just not settling.
Yeah.
Right. And we start there.
Yeah. That's so good. You kind of start where anybody is at. That sounds kind of cliche-ish, but in something like this, what a lovely way to start, and to have them join you. Well, I know we're kind of beginning to wind down in our talk today, and it's been great to learn about this. I'd love to have you come back at some point to expand around some of these things, and actually maybe what you're doing, and so our audience gets a real sense of, okay, I can see how these things play out. So maybe we can do something in our clinician series where we kind of go behind the curtain, if you will, and let
Mhm.
folks see what you're doing in your trainings and what you're doing in your individual work, so they get it. But for now, as we wind down, let's let folks know how they can find out more about Light, your 20-hour course coming up, and more about you personally and your work you're doing.
Absolutely. So our website is lightmvmt.com. Or since we're a new nonprofit, we can also reach us at lightmovement, spelled out, .org. It will go back to our .com website. The reason why it's initialed MVMT was it was way too expensive to pay for movement. So we went with the
Oh,
short version. So you can reach us there. And then we have many tabs on our website, all done by a volunteer, because right now we're all volunteers. And so we have our offerings page where you can see the classes, workshops, trainings, retreat. We have a big retreat in November here in Colorado, beautiful Colorado. I highly recommend. And then we'll be, like I said, building our online platform. So people that don't live in Colorado that want to learn some tools and some classes, we'll be building that in the next month. So I encourage people to keep looking at our website for that as well.
you guys have a really lovely website. If I could just kind of chip in on that, my takeaway from that is also my takeaway of you too. There's a glow about your website. There's a warmth to it. There's a warmth and a glow to you too. You're not hard to feel, in this process, and that's a lovely art you're bringing to this. And your I don't know how you did it, or the volunteer did it, but they captured this warmth that's a part of this process where they don't feel alone. They're invited into something really quite lovely that, you're saying maybe we get to reframe what grief can be. We're all going to go through it. We don't get through this life without it, but maybe it gets to be something that we say, hey, this is going to be possible. And so you're bringing some optimism, I think, and some hope to this. And it's really a lovely approach, Amy.
Thank you. And our hope is as we work with growing with our grief, we will then choose to work with healing our grieving world and holding space for our grieving world because we have to. There's too much grief right now.
And I think when our grief is not processed, it becomes pathological. Hurt people. And when we don't work through this in healthy ways, we're at risk for one, not growing anymore ourselves, but also to affect those around us in ways that, we don't have to. And I think what you're talking about in grief and healing, it's got a larger meaning where our world gets to be very different if we're all embracing something around the losses that we're having without retaliating or becoming hurtful in return. So it has been fantastic to meet you today, to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us. And we're going to look forward to having you back at some point.
Thank you. It would be my honor.
That'd be great. Also want to thank you, our listeners, for dropping by and joining Amy and me today. It's always great to have you with us. Regarding our episode, I want to remind you that it and its resources and all of our other episodes can be found on our webpage at triadhq.com/BHT. Thanks again for being with us on the show. And we'll look forward to having you back with us next time on Behavioral Health Today.
We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Triad Behavioral Health Network, all rights reserved.